This is a project that I did a few years ago, and so I wanted to post it and kind of share with you guys some things that I would do differently if I were creating this piece today. Some things I've learned and some best practices that I've come across. So the first is, it's probably pretty obvious, but I would use a much larger brush. I mean, using this tiny thing on, this is a 12 by 12 wood board. But even on a 8 by 8 or a 6 by 6, I mean this brush is just so tiny. My my time and your time is worth more than that. So I would definitely be using a thicker brush, first of all. Now I learned to do encaustic with a heat gun, and so it is the tool that I'm most comfortable with for fusing. But when you get into larger pieces, like larger than an 8 by 8, into 12 by 12s and 16 by 20s and things like that, the blowtorch really helps you work a lot faster. The heat gun can take a while to fuse, and I like to work fast. As bad as that is sometimes, it's I definitely prefer for things to move quickly. So so the blowtorch would help with that. You get smoother surfaces a lot of the times, and it moves quicker. So I think for this piece, I would also be using a blowtorch to fuse with. Now, my husband is from California, so he talks about certain places a lot, which is why I wanted to create this piece. It's a map of Catalina Island off the coast of Los Angeles. I think it's Los Angeles, right? I'm not as familiar with California as he is. Um, but what I'm doing is I printed off a map so I could, usually I freehand, but with this one I decided to use a map as a reference to kind of get the proportions right as close as possible. So what I'm doing is I just laid it down on the wax where I wanted it to go, and I'm dotting. I'm not drawing the lines because I don't want to mess up the map or anything, and that'll probably tear and not help with my piece at all. So I'm just using dots to kind of go around the edges, and you can see in the video it actually works really well to give you a lot of detail. Now this is white shellac. This is shellac that I've pigmented with some dry pigments. And once it's dry, I'm gonna use my blowtorch on it. Now I'm going over the lines, so I have my dots from where I put it in the map, but now I'm going through and I'm carving the lines out. And I can't decide if this was the right way to go or if I should have done shellac over the whole surface and then added the map on top of it. I think I might need to try it that way to see if it works a little bit better, because fusing or doing the shellac burn with the lines, like I end up erasing some of the lines, and so I have to redraw them, but then I lose some of the detail. And in the redraw, I just don't get as good of lines as I had initially because they melted when I used my blowtorch to do the shellac burn. So I mean, I think it turned out pretty well regardless, but I don't know if it would be better to just do shellac over the whole surface and then do my map. I'm kind of torn. And of course, don't forget when you're carving lines into your wax like this, you need it to be warm but not really hot. So when you fuse it, especially with a blowtorch, you want to let it sit for a few minutes and kind of cool down until it's just a little bit warm, and then draw your lines. Now I'm filling my lines with oil paint because I want them to stand out. I'm using white for the contrast against the black. And then I wipe away the excess oil paint with linseed oil. Now, if you've seen me do this technique in some of my other videos, you know I've talked about before that when you are working with linseed oil, you need to not leave your rags or paper towels in a big pile somewhere in the corner of your studio. You need to lay them out flat and let them oxidize, because linseed oil oxidizes off from the surface. And when it does that, it creates heat, it generates heat. And if you leave your rags and your paper towels in a big soaking pile, they can spontaneously combust. And I honestly, I don't know at what point it gets to that point. I think it has to be pretty wet and pretty like a lot of wet rags, but I don't even take any chances. I lay my paper towels when I'm done, when they're covered with oil paint and linseed oil and I can't use them anymore. I lay them out flat and I let them oxidize for a few days until I can throw them away. It's kind of hard to see because the light is reflecting on the surface of the painting, but the oil paint is pretty clean. I try to take it as until I don't get any residue from the lines anymore. Now this is the last step in this piece, but it's the one that takes the longest. What I'm doing is I have a stencil brush that I'm using to add texture. So one of the things that I would do here as well, that I started to do later on in this piece, but I didn't start out doing it, is I would have built up um, the island of Catalina and the coast of California. I would have added some more layers of wax to give them a little bit more buildup like the land has away from the ocean. Um, right now I'm trying to do it with my stencil brush, and that's just taking forever. And, you know, layer by layer, it's just this part of the process already takes so long that you don't need to add extra time if you don't have to. So what I would do now is I would take my brush and I would add a few layers, fuse them without doing the stippling, and just kind of build up the wax in those land mass areas. And then I would take my stencil brush later when the wax is somewhat cool but still kind of warm, and I would stipple it up and down. The stencil brushes are great for just going up and down, and they add this really awesome texture that kind of looks like trees or like, yeah, kind of like trees, like landmass. So that's why I'm adding that texture to differentiate it from the water, which is smooth. Now, the edges are the hardest part of this technique. So I go through and I do the middle part. I do all the texture of the middle part and try to build it up as much as I can. And then the edges are last. So I'm using my tiniest stencil brush that I have. And when I do the edges, what I do is I pinch it because it has wax on it. When you pinch it, it stays in place for a little while you're working, and you can you can really go through and kind of detail those edges. You still have to be careful, but you can add a lot of detail and get into those tiny little nooks and little areas that are really hard to get to. Also, one other thing that I would change is when I do my shellac burn. At this point, I was still kind of practicing my technique of doing a dry burn. This was several years ago, so I was still kind of learning how to do it. And one thing I've come to be better at is doing just straight strokes across the surface with the blowtorch when I do a shellac burn, instead of trying to do circles like I do with my heat gun. That was kind of my go-to arm movement for shellac burns, and it doesn't really work that well. Um, I don't really like the cells and the look that I get. It seems kind of uneven when I do a shellac burn that way. So I've really practiced kind of just brushing the blowtorch back and forth, going straight across the piece and then down slightly, back and forth, like just straight lines, and it works much better to get really good, interesting shellac burns and good cells. You can see at this point I've started building up the texture in the landmass areas and fusing it to the texture below and then letting it cool a little bit before I go through and add more texture. So again, I'm just making it harder and longer than it needs to be. So just if you want to try this stippling, it's really fun to add this texture. I love the look of it. But if you try to do it, I would suggest, build up the texture or the layers of wax, build up the wax in the areas that you want it, and then just add texture as the last layer. You get the same effect, but it does not take as long. And you can see the buildup of wax here in this picture and the texture. It's so fun. It looks so cool. And that is this piece. I would love to hear your suggestions. If you've tried any of these techniques, if you have other things that you would do differently, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.